I've been wrong before, brother. You know, I know I said you would never be nothing, but, you know, now I gotta eat my words,
I said the same thing about you, and I was true.
I think he hated him. I think it was a pressure thing, you know. I think it was more threatened by than hate. If I had to, you know, because, you know, Prince coming on strong, man. You know, he's gaining momentum.
By the 1990s, everyone in the music industry refused to work with Rick James.
You know, because, you know, he would step across the line. Habitually, he's a habitual line stepper.
The man who created Super Freak had become so toxic that artists fled from collaborations. Record labels wouldn't return his calls. Even the Murphy brothers distanced themselves.
Because of my complexion, he used to call me Darkness. He calls me and my brother Darkness. He calls us Darkness Brothers.
This is how Rick James destroyed every relationship and became the most hated man in music. Even before Rick James reached the pinnacle of his success, those who worked closely with him began noticing disturbing patterns of behavior that would eventually destroy his career and relationships. Born James Ambrose Johnson Jr. in Buffalo, New York, Rick had shown musical genius from an early age, but that talent came paired with a volatile personality and an inflated sense of entitlement that made him increasingly difficult to work with.
I don't know. I think it's a combination of my band and Stone
You
Sour
bet it
band.
is.
Yeah, the band and my engineer, Tom Fly, you know, and my girls, you know, it's a combination of all of us.
The music industry first got a taste of Rick's problematic behavior during his early appearances on shows like Soul Train. Don Cornelius, the respected host who had worked with countless artists, found Rick to be unpredictable and difficult to manage. Unlike other guests who showed respect for the platform and professionalism during interviews, Rick would often make inappropriate comments, interrupt the flow of conversation, and display an arrogance that rubbed everyone the wrong way. What made Rick particularly challenging was his inability to share credit graciously. Even when acknowledging his band and collaborators, as he did reluctantly in interviews, there was always an underlying sense that he viewed himself as the true creative force behind everything. This attitude became more pronounced as his success grew, and it began to alienate the very people who had helped build his career. Industry insiders started talking about Rick's backstage behavior long before his legal troubles made headlines. Session musicians who worked on his early albums reported that he was demanding, often cruel to backup singers, and had a tendency to explode into rage when things didn't go exactly as he envisioned. Unlike other temperamental artists who at least showed gratitude for good work, Rick seemed to view every collaboration as an opportunity to assert his dominance. The warning signs were there in his treatment of women from the very beginning of his career. Female backup singers and dancers who worked with Rick in the late 1970s and early 1980s whispered about his inappropriate behavior, his wandering hands during rehearsals, and his belief that his fame entitled him to sexual access to any woman in his vicinity. These stories were largely kept quiet at the time, as speaking out against a rising star could destroy a young performer's career.
Rick, you so hot.
Oh, yes, I am. Could one of you girls blow on my face or something?
You are
Cool me off?
so hot.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you.
Rick's public persona was built around sexual bravado and the image of an untouchable funk king. But those who worked with him knew that his behavior crossed lines that even the permissive music industry of the 1970s found uncomfortable. His comments to female audience members and dancers weren't just part of his act. They reflected a genuine belief that his celebrity status put him above normal social boundaries and expectations. Record executives at Motown initially overlooked these personality flaws because Rick was making them enormous amounts of money. His breakthrough album, Come Get It, in 1978 had been a commercial success, and his follow-up releases were generating even more revenue. But behind closed doors, label executives were already discussing the Rick James problem and wondering how long they could continue working with someone whose behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and potentially liability-creating. The isolation began early, with many artists who initially wanted to collaborate with Rick quickly changing their minds after brief interactions. Musicians who had been excited about the prospect of working with the rising funk star would leave meetings feeling uncomfortable, disrespected, or outright threatened. Word began to spread through the industry's informal networks that Rick James was talented but dangerous, a combination that made him increasingly toxic as a potential collaborator. What nobody fully understood at the time was that Rick's behavior was being fueled by rapidly escalating drug use, particularly cocaine, which was amplifying his natural tendencies toward aggression and grandiosity. The drugs weren't creating new personality traits, but they were removing whatever filters and inhibitions might have kept his worst impulses in check. This chemical enhancement of his already problematic behavior patterns would soon transform him from merely difficult to genuinely dangerous. By the early 1980s, Rick James had reached the peak of his commercial success, but his relationships within the music industry were becoming increasingly strained due to his growing paranoia, competitiveness, and inability to handle being challenged or overshadowed by other artists. The most visible manifestation of these problems came in his bitter rivalry with Prince, a conflict that revealed just how toxic Rick could become when his ego was threatened. The relationship between Rick James and Prince began professionally, with Prince serving as an opening act for Rick during tours in the early 1980s. At the time, Rick was the established star with multiple hit albums, while Prince was still building his reputation. However, those who witnessed the dynamic between them on tour, including Morris Day, could sense the tension immediately. Rick treated Prince not as a fellow artist deserving of respect, but as a threat that needed to be contained and diminished. What made the situation particularly explosive was that Prince was everything Rick wasn't: disciplined, professional, and completely focused on his craft rather than on destructive behavior. While Rick was often late to rehearsals, showed up intoxicated to meetings, and treated his band members poorly, Prince was known for his perfectionism and respect for the creative process. This contrast made Rick's own shortcomings more obvious to everyone around them, and he responded with increasing hostility rather than self-reflection.
I think he hated him. I think it was a pressure thing. I think it was more threatened by than hate. If I had to, because Prince coming on strong, man. He's gaining momentum.
Morris Day's observation about Rick feeling threatened rather than genuinely hating Prince revealed the deeper psychology behind Rick's increasingly difficult behavior. Rick's ego couldn't handle the possibility that someone younger and more talented might overshadow him, so he began actively working to undermine Prince both professionally and personally. This wasn't just artistic competition. It was a calculated campaign of sabotage that demonstrated how Rick's narcissism made him incapable of supporting other artists' success. The MTV controversy further illustrated Rick's tendency to blame external forces rather than examining his own behavior when things didn't go his way. When MTV refused to play his Super Freak video in heavy rotation, Rick immediately accused the network of racism, rather than considering that his increasingly provocative and problematic public image might be making broadcasters hesitant to associate with him.
And that is a problem for him, and one that I recognize. I'd love to play Rick James on MTV if he did a rock and roll song.
Rick's response to MTV's rejection revealed his complete inability to understand how his own behavior was contributing to his professional problems. Instead of recognizing that his reputation for violence, drug abuse, and inappropriate conduct was making him a liability for mainstream media outlets, he chose to view every setback as evidence of a conspiracy against him. This victim mentality prevented him from making the changes that might have salvaged his career and relationships. The irony was that MTV's decision had less to do with Rick's race than with his increasingly unstable public persona. Network executives were already aware of stories about his violent behavior and drug abuse. and they were unwilling to promote an artist who represented such a significant risk to their brand. Meanwhile, Prince was gaining the exact kind of mainstream acceptance that Rick craved, precisely because Prince maintained professionalism and avoided the scandals that were becoming synonymous with Rick's name. Industry insiders began to notice that Rick's paranoia was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. His conviction that everyone was working against him led him to behave in ways that actually did turn people against him. He would arrive at meetings already defensive and hostile, treat potential collaborators with suspicion and disrespect, and then interpret their negative reactions as proof that his persecution complex was justified. The Prince rivalry also demonstrated Rick's complete inability to mentor younger artists or share the spotlight graciously. Instead of embracing his role as an elder statesman of funk who could help guide the next generation, Rick viewed every emerging talent as a threat to be destroyed. This attitude made him increasingly isolated within a music community that valued collaboration and mutual support, and it sent a clear message that working with Rick James meant accepting his need to be the center of attention at all times. As the 1980s progressed, Rick's reputation for being impossible to work with spread throughout the industry, with the Prince situation serving as a cautionary tale for any artist considering collaboration with him. Musicians, producers, and record executives began to understand that Rick's talent came with a level of toxicity that made any professional relationship unsustainable. The stories that would eventually make Rick James infamous came not from music industry insiders, but from his relationship with Eddie Murphy's family, particularly Eddie's brother, Charlie Murphy. These incidents, later immortalized in Dave Chappelle's comedy sketches, revealed the extent to which Rick's cocaine-fueled behavior had made him not just difficult to work with, but genuinely dangerous to be around.
We got closer, started hanging out. My brother didn't do any of this. So at night, when Eddie would break out, we would all be getting crazy and wild. And if I was hanging with Rick, he had this thing with me where he used to always with me, man.
The Charlie Murphy stories weren't just amusing anecdotes about celebrity excess. They were documented evidence of Rick's pattern of escalating violence and complete disregard for boundaries. Charlie Murphy's account of being physically assaulted by Rick at Studio 54 demonstrated how Rick's cocaine use had eliminated whatever impulse control he might have once possessed. The fact that Rick felt entitled to strike someone he considered a friend in a public venue over what amounted to nothing more than his own paranoid delusions showed how far his behavior had deteriorated. What made these incidents particularly revealing was Rick's complete lack of remorse or awareness that his behavior was unacceptable. Even when recounting the events years later, Rick showed no understanding that assaulting people was wrong, instead treating the violence as natural consequences of his celebrity status. His attitude was that anyone who spent time in his presence should expect to be subjected to his whims, no matter how violent or irrational they might be.
So he had these dirty cowboy boots on. Pushed us out of the way, barged in the house. My brother had these brand new couches, they were suede, right? And he gets on the couch and says, "Why don't I stretch out?" And just started grinding mud all into the couch, man.
The couch incident revealed another disturbing aspect of Rick's personality: his need to destroy other people's property as a way of asserting dominance. This wasn't accidental damage caused by careless partying. It was deliberate destruction designed to humiliate his hosts and demonstrate that his presence in their lives came with unavoidable costs. Rick's explanation that Eddie could buy another one showed his complete inability to understand concepts like respect, gratitude, or basic human decency. These stories spread throughout Hollywood like wildfire, not because they were funny, but because they served as warnings about what happened when you allowed Rick James into your personal space. Other celebrities began to understand that inviting Rick to parties or events meant accepting the risk of property damage, physical violence, and public humiliation. Word spread quickly through the entertainment community's informal networks that Rick James was not worth the trouble he inevitably brought with him. The incidents also revealed how Rick's drug use had destroyed his ability to read social situations accurately. He genuinely seemed to believe that his behavior was acceptable, even endearing, when in reality it was driving away everyone who had once considered him a friend. His inability to recognize the difference between entertaining behavior and destructive behavior made him increasingly isolated from the very community that had once embraced him. What made the Charlie Murphy incidents particularly damaging to Rick's reputation was that they involved Eddie Murphy, who was at the height of his career and influence in Hollywood. Eddie's decision to distance himself from Rick sent a clear message to the rest of the entertainment industry about the level of toxicity that Rick represented. When someone as successful and well-connected as Eddie Murphy couldn't maintain a friendship with Rick due to his behavior, it served as a warning to everyone else about the impossibility of working with him. The cocaine-fueled violence that characterized these incidents also demonstrated how Rick's drug addiction had progressed from recreational use to genuine psychological dependency. The paranoia, aggression, and grandiosity that cocaine can produce were amplifying Rick's worst personality traits to dangerous levels. Industry insiders who had once been willing to overlook his difficult personality as the price of working with a talented artist began to realize that he had crossed the line from merely challenging to genuinely unsafe. More importantly, these incidents showed that Rick's problematic behavior wasn't limited to professional settings. He was bringing the same level of chaos and violence to his personal relationships, which meant that anyone who got close to him, whether as a friend, collaborator, or romantic partner, was at risk of becoming the target of his unpredictable rage. This realization fundamentally changed how people in the entertainment industry viewed Rick James, transforming him from a difficult but manageable artist into someone who represented an unacceptable threat to everyone around him. By the early 1990s, Rick James's behavior had escalated beyond mere industry rumors and celebrity gossip into genuine criminal activity that would forever destroy his reputation and make him completely unemployable in the entertainment industry. The assault and torture charges that emerged in 1991 and 1992 revealed the true extent of Rick's dangerous behavior and marked the point where even his most loyal supporters were forced to abandon him.
But, there's a little sugar in his tank, I mean, there's, a little, he's, a little sugar going on up in there.
Don't say that, Rick. Don't say that.
What, he's basically homosexual, okay? Now I have a problem with that, because I love him still.
The Judge Joe Brown appearance, while focusing on a relatively minor financial dispute, offered a glimpse into Rick's mindset and his inability to maintain appropriate boundaries even in formal legal settings. His casual bigotry and inappropriate comments demonstrated that years of unchecked behavior had left him incapable of functioning normally in professional situations. This wasn't just poor judgment. It was evidence of someone whose moral compass had been completely destroyed by drugs and unchecked power. The real horror began in July 1991, when Rick and his girlfriend, Tanya Hijazi, kidnapped and tortured 24-year-old Frances Alley at Rick's Hollywood Hills home. According to court testimony, they held Alley captive for 6 days, during which time they burned her repeatedly with hot cocaine pipes, forced her to perform sexual acts, and subjected her to psychological torture that left permanent physical and emotional scars. This wasn't a crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was sustained, calculated cruelty that revealed the complete absence of empathy or human decency. What made the situation even more disturbing was that while Rick was out on bail awaiting trial for the Alley assault, he and Hijazi attacked another woman, Mary Sauger, a music industry executive who had come to meet with them for business purposes. The attack on Sauger lasted 20 hours and involved the same pattern of cocaine-fueled violence and SA that had characterized the Alley incident. The fact that Rick was willing to commit another violent crime while already facing serious charges demonstrated his complete inability to understand consequences or modify his behavior. Rick's appearance on Judge Joe Brown years later showed that even after serving prison time, he had learned nothing from his experiences. His casual cruelty, inappropriate comments, and complete lack of self-awareness demonstrated that the man who had tortured multiple women was still fundamentally the same person who believed that his celebrity status entitled him to treat others however he pleased. The trial proceedings revealed the full extent of Rick's depravity to the music industry and the general public. Testimony described how Rick would torture his victims until they lost consciousness, then revive them with water to continue the abuse. The deliberate, systematic nature of the violence made it impossible for anyone to dismiss his behavior as the result of temporary drug-induced psychosis or momentary loss of control. During the trial, Rick's complete lack of remorse became obvious to everyone present. Court observers noted that he fell asleep and began snoring audibly, while victim Mary Sauger testified about the 20-hour ordeal she had endured at his hands. This wasn't just disrespectful. It was clear evidence that Rick felt no guilt, shame, or responsibility for the pain he had inflicted on innocent women. The music industry's response was swift and absolute. Record labels that had once competed for Rick's services refused to return his calls. Musicians who had previously sought collaborations with him publicly distanced themselves from any association with his name. Radio stations stopped playing his music, not because of any organized boycott, but because programmers didn't want to be associated with someone who had committed such horrific crimes. Even after Rick was released from prison in 1996, after serving only 2 years of his sentence, the industry remained closed to him. His attempts to restart his career were met with polite but firm rejections from every major label, producer, and venue. The few people who were willing to work with him quickly discovered that prison had done nothing to change his fundamental personality or behavior patterns. The legal nightmare that destroyed Rick's career wasn't just about the specific crimes he committed. It was about the complete moral bankruptcy that those crimes revealed. The entertainment industry, for all its tolerance of eccentric behavior and personal problems, could not and would not continue to support someone whose actions demonstrated such complete disregard for human dignity and basic decency. Rick James had crossed a line from which there could be no return, and everyone in the industry understood that working with him would mean accepting complicity in his pattern of violence and abuse. The final decade of Rick James's life was a study in the consequences of burning every bridge and alienating every potential ally in an industry that once had embraced his talent. Released from prison in 1996, Rick discovered that the music world had not only moved on without him, but had actively worked to erase his presence from their collective memory. His attempts at a comeback were met with a combination of disgust, fear, and indifference that made clear just how completely he had destroyed his own legacy. Even in his relationships with longtime friends like Eddie Murphy, Rick's toxic personality made normal interaction impossible. His tendency to criticize and belittle the very people who had supported him throughout his career demonstrated that prison had done nothing to address the fundamental character flaws that had destroyed his professional relationships.
Rick was talking to Eddie. Said that got album you did and party all the time. It was terrible.
Wait. But Rick James wrote that song.
Exactly. And that's what Eddie said to him. But you read it. He said, but you wrote it, James. Yeah, and I should have kept it for my myself.
The fact that he would disparage a song he had written himself simply to hurt someone who had been loyal to him showed that his capacity for self-sabotage remained intact. The few industry figures who were willing to work with Rick in his final years quickly discovered that his time in prison had only intensified his worst traits. The paranoia, entitlement, and casual cruelty that had characterized his behavior in the 1980s and early 1990s had become even more pronounced. Studio musicians who participated in sessions for his 1997 album, Urban Rhapsody, reported that Rick was impossible to work with, frequently flying into rages, making unreasonable demands, and treating everyone around him with contempt. The 1998 SA allegations, though ultimately dropped, served as a reminder to the industry that Rick remained dangerous. Even those who might have been willing to give him a second chance after his prison sentence were forced to acknowledge that he hadn't changed. The pattern of violence and abuse that had characterized his earlier behavior was still present, making any professional association with him an unacceptable risk. Radio programmers, venue owners, and record executives who might have been willing to overlook Rick's past crimes for commercial reasons found themselves unable to justify working with someone who continued to generate negative publicity and legal problems. The entertainment industry operates on relationships and reputation, and Rick had systematically destroyed both through decades of inexcusable behavior. The stroke he suffered during a 1998 concert served as a symbolic end to whatever remained of his performing career. Even his own body seemed to be rejecting the lifestyle that had defined his adult life. The combination of decades of drug abuse, the stress of legal troubles, and the isolation that came with being a pariah had finally taken its toll on his physical health. By the time Dave Chappelle's comedy sketches brought Rick James back into popular consciousness in the early 2000s, he had become a cautionary tale rather than a celebrated artist. The "I'm Rick James, bitch" catchphrase that introduced him to a new generation was less a celebration of his musical achievements than a mockery of his fall from grace. The fact that his primary cultural relevance in his final years came from being the subject of comedy sketches about his worst behavior demonstrated how completely his legacy had been tainted. When Rick James died alone in his Los Angeles apartment in August 2004, the response from the music industry was notably muted. There were no grand tributes from fellow artists, no industry-wide moments of silence, and no campaigns to celebrate his musical contributions. The silence spoke volumes about how thoroughly he had alienated everyone who had once been part of his professional world. The autopsy findings, which revealed 9 different drugs in his system at the time of death, served as a final reminder of the self-destructive patterns that had defined his later years. Even in death, Rick James remained a cautionary tale about the consequences of allowing talent to be overshadowed by violence, addiction, and criminal behavior. The ultimate tragedy of Rick James's story isn't just that he wasted his considerable musical gifts, but that he destroyed the lives of innocent people along the way. His refusal to take responsibility for his actions, his inability to change his behavior even when faced with serious consequences, and his complete lack of empathy for his victims made him someone that the music industry could never again embrace. In the end, Rick James didn't just burn bridges. He incinerated any possibility of redemption, leaving behind a legacy defined more by the people he hurt than by the music he created. Anyway, that's it for this video, folks. Bye.